Hi guys, Mr. Greiner. Making here, a video for you guys in place of a Brinkley reading if you so choose. I hope you find this useful. I'm going to run through some material. Part of it's review of 10th grade material. Part of it is answering that question. How does America form its position of neutrality, and then why does America abandon its position of neutrality? What's sort of the steps and process that America gets involved in World War II? So some things I'm going to go fast through because they are sort of expected that you have seen them before, though certainly a quick Wikipedia search would get you the answer for a lot of things if you're still confused. So first of all, we got to realize that America in the 1920s was not quite isolationist yet. America was sort of unilateralist, meaning it did not want to engage in any sort of permanent alliances, but it still wanted to sort of control world outcomes for the greater good and for its own good. And this is especially, we're talking about non-Latin America. Latin America is a different kettle of fish. We're still engaged in pretty aggressive foreign policy down in those regions like Honduras, etc. But in the rest of the world, what we're doing is attempting to limit arms and limit war so that we don't have to have permanent alliances everywhere. So the first of these is in 1921. You see a whole host of things come out of there, but the idea is that US, Japan, France, England, etc. will have basically a static ratio of armaments, especially true around naval ships. That, there will be a ratio of, I believe it was, I can't remember off the top of my head, 3 to 2 for America and Great Britain. That for every 3 ships we have, they could have 2, et cetera, et cetera. So this still allowed growth for countries like Japan, so they jumped in and signed it. It allowed America to sort of say, we will not have to build lots of ships that we don't want in order to deal with these problems. Win-win. And you can see here, we want the world to be a more safe place, but we don't want to have to do very much to create that. And you see that as well in the sort of the great symbolic gesture of the Kellogg-Briand Treaty. 60 nations sign on saying we will not use war as an instrument of national policy. There's no enforcement method. It was supposed to be like, if somebody breaks that, we'll all shake their heads at them and they will morally be against it. But you see here really a culture-wide, a international-wide desire to no longer experience things like we saw in World War I. We see, bestsellers like All Quiet on the Western Front. We see just a general dissatisfaction with war. And America thought that that might be enough. We do not want to be in the League of Nations. We do not want to have anything similar along those lines, but we'd like to we don't want to have to go to war again. So there are a few individuals, as we know in the 1930s, who will make us go to war, who will make most of the world go to war, and call them sort of disruptors, warmongers, whatever you want. Going to run through those sort of cast of characters so you get a sense of who we're dealing with and who America needs to be responding to. So the first of these cast of characters is the sort of comical, farcical figure of Benito Mussolini. Not comical, certainly, if you live underneath Mussolini's dictatorship, but comical from an outside perspective. Not unpopular in America in the 1920s, but by the 1930s, he has needs to be taken more seriously because he's using war as an instrument of foreign policy. He is an inventor of the idea of fascism, which is to combine the ideas of nationalism and socialism. So socialism used the government to control the economy for the greater good. Usually that's to improve the economic condition of everyone within the country. Nationalism, on the other hand, says there are some people who are better than other people. So in his case, it's we need to control the Italian economy so that the nation of Italy can be stronger, and we must work together using one voice in order to do this. So he really sees himself as recreating the glory of the Roman Empire and saying that we are going to sort of control the Mediterranean Sea. Part of that process for him begins in becoming an imperialist power. All that's left for Italy is Ethiopia, so they go after Ethiopia. Ethiopia, however, is a member of the League of Nations. And so if you attack Ethiopia, you should be attacked by all members of the League of Nations. The League of Nations does not attack. There is international condemnation, but because there's a Great Depression worldwide, because there's a lack of desire for war, nations sort of wag their finger and that's it. So Mussolini, his invasion doesn't work long term. He doesn't have the funds or the resources to pull this off, nor the organizational skill or the control over Italy to pull this off. But this guy does. So this is Hitler. His rise to power takes over in 1933, basically the same time FDR gains the presidency in America, to kind of pin it to the American timeline. He has sort of gains enough control in the Reichstag, even though he's a minority party, that he's able to declare himself chancellor, and then he's declared chancellor, and then he's able to declare himself Führer after the death of the president. He then goes off to maintain absolute dictatorial powers and begins his sort of aggressive military expansion. At first, the German military is a joke, so it takes him a few years to really get going, but by 1936, he's violating the Treaty of Versailles by invading the Rhineland. Actually, I think I have that wrong, it's 34. But he invades the Rhineland, and then he goes and annexes Austria, for you Sound of Music fans, saying that he's uniting the German-speaking people of the world. He then goes off and says that there are more German-speaking people in the western boundary of Czechoslovakia, known as the Sudetenland. He is then allowed to control the Sudetenland by Britain and France, saying, we will not oppose you. That's what we call appeasement in the Munich Pact. He then takes all of Czechoslovakia for his own significant moment in the development of atomic bombs. We'll talk about that later. And finally invades Poland in 1939. By that point, it's clear that this individual is not going to stop and that he wants world domination, European domination. And that's the beginning of World War II from a European perspective. I skipped over Spanish Civil War. I'm going to continue to skip over the Spanish Civil War. Certainly a significant news event in the 1930s. What really you need to walk away with is the sense that democracy is losing. Italy, gone. Germany, gone. Japan, gone. We'll talk about that next. Spain, gone. Democracies are crumbling around the world. Strong men are coming into positions of power. And so this is sort of a worrisome trend. And you also have in Japan a similar process taking place. The military takes over the democratic parliamentary government and then becomes a sort of a military junta dictatorship, who the face of that military dictatorship was Hideki Tojo. They then go start invading Japan because, like Germany, they believe that they need the resources, or what Hitler called Lebensraum, or living room, of other nations in order for their own nation to succeed. Japan isn't really fascist, though there is elements of fascism in the way that they view the world. Closed systems, racial superiority, etc. So they are doing terrible, horrible, awful things to China. If you've never read about the rape of Nanking, you should learn about that at some point in your life. It's deeply troubling. And the U.S. is sort of condemning them, threatening them, but not doing anything to stop Japan from destroying our ally of China. So where does this come from? Why is the U.S. sort of acting passively as dictators are marching around the world? Certainly part of that answer is the Depression. Part of that answer is the Nye Commission. So in the U.S. Senate in the 1930s had a series of hearings about foreign policy run by Gerald Nye, a Midwestern senator. I believe he's from Minnesota. And he rails against, along with this commission, it has a series of reports basically, how did America get involved in World War I? What they say is, yes, America had a position of neutrality in World War I, but it should be understood to be permissive neutrality, discretionary neutrality. Basically, the president was able to be neutral however he felt like being neutral. And he goes off and says how America got into World War I, something that he would view as absolutely negative, was that they were selling munitions. Those munitions were carried by U.S. ships. Munitions were only being sold to Great Britain because of Britain's blockade of Germany. And finally, we gave loans to warring nations. And they sort of said that as the world gears up to war, America must not tie its economic prosperity to the military success of another nation. So if two countries are at war, we do not sell them food, we do not sell them guns, we do not give them bank loans. We are done. We cannot profit off the war of another nation. But really got to understand how deeply sarcastic and bitter and angry this report is. So I'm going to read a passage from there so you can get a sense of what this report sounds like. War isn't such a bad thing when we don't have to be in it. But, we said, look at those Germans. They're destroying American cargoes, going to England and France and sinking English passenger vessels with Americans on board. Maybe something ought to be done about it. But whatever we do, let's not get into that war. How childish it all was. This expectation of success and staying out of a war politically while economically we stayed in it. How childish this permissive flip-flop neutrality of ours and our belief that we could go on and on supplying the sinews of war to one or even both sides and avoid ourselves being ultimately drawn into the engagement with our lives and our fortunes at stake. Just anger and sort of disappointment coming out of this. So the result of these sort of commissions is a increasingly stricter neutrality acts. Each act of neutrality being stricter than the next. So I'm not going to ask you to learn about all the neutrality acts. I'm going to ask you to sort of think of them as a package. But no, they get stronger, not weaker, over the course of 35 to 37. And this is when Ethiopia is being invaded. This is when Hitler's becoming increasingly aggressive and increasingly anti-Semitic. This is when Japan is launching invasions of China that are shock your very humanity. And we are becoming increasingly neutral because of that idea that America was trying to profit from the war and stay out of it at the same time. So therefore, we cannot profit. So we have arms embargoes for both victim and aggressor nations. If France is invaded by Germany, they're on their own. Warn citizens who are traveling that they're at their own risk, basically saying, if you get on a boat and there's a war going on and that boat gets sunk, expect no protection or help from America. And then 1937, you get sort of the strictest one, which is that if you want to buy American goods and you are at war, you must pay cash, no U.S. loans, and you must carry your own goods away on your own vessels. American ships and American wealth will not be tied into this war in any way. That really ties the hands of the president. This is Congress looking to limit the powers of the presidency to prevent war, even if there's a Hitler. There is. Even if we have Mussolini, even if with the Japanese military, we are not getting involved in this thing. That is strict neutrality. So we are now an isolationist nation. 1920s, we're unilateralist. 1930s, we are isolationist. So they are limiting FDR. And so FDR, we got to understand, has certain beliefs. He is Wilsonian. He is a liberal. He believes the U.S. has a destiny to fill around the world, but he's the one being limited. So think like, really is not all that different than Woodrow Wilson when it comes to his sort of values about American power. So he believes in free trade like Woodrow Wilson, which is the idea of lowering tariffs to increase trade. Great for depression, clearly a rebuke of Hoover's policies. He even tries to increase trade relations with Soviets. His policy in Latin America is very not Wilsonian. It's the good neighbor policy, basically saying that we will much more dollar diplomacy, much more about tying America economically to Latin America than it is about controlling them militarily. Then there was an attempt at an arms reduction conference, which fails. And so you can see FDR's increasingly frustration, but also he's deeply aware of the vast majority of the American public sentiment, which is we do not want war. And you can see the balance he's trying to strike in the quarantine speech of 1937. In here it says, "It seems to be unfortunately true that the epidemic of world lawlessness is spreading. When an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine separation of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of disease." That's all he says. He doesn't say we're going to start the UN. He doesn't say we're going to invade, China to help them out. He's basically sort of suggesting this very vague principle that the aggressor nations need to be confronted with some measure of unity by the non-aggressor nations of Britain and France, etc. And this is a pretty passive, pretty banal statement. This just says America should maybe do something about this growing presence of Hitler and Mussolini. And the backlash to his speech was, as we hear Alan Brinkley say, disturbingly hostile. And Roosevelt has to draw back. He's rebuked, saying, "You are being a warmonger." So for the next few years, Roosevelt has to give a series of speeches talking about how much he hates war, how much war is bad, how much he does not want to use war because of he's being labeled by his political enemies as this sort of warmonger who wants to send your kids into Europe to be slaughtered by the millions. So in World War, I'm sorry, we already went over this. And so what we see is starting in September of 1939, the war has actually begun. We've gone from a theoretical war where there are aggressor nations sort of gobbling up smaller, less powerful nations, sometimes through legal means, sometimes through invasions. And now we've just got war. So in September of 1939, after the invasion of Poland, the arms embargo is dropped. America is able to sell weapons. So that's step one of backing away from cash and carry. Step two is as the war gets bad, FDR is going to take increasingly less neutral actions. And he can always sort of sell them from another perspective. So in the summer of 1940, after about 8 months of the war, France falls. And you get the Battle of Britain. If you saw Darkest Hour, that's what we're talking about here. And so the Battle of Britain is sort of Britain stands alone, sort of the great sort of, you go to Britain today, like that's their heroic moment of World War II is the Battle of Britain, as Germany is launching plane attack after plane attack against Britain, and Britain is sort of thinly defended and yet standing alone against the might of the German military machine. And so FDR desperately wants to help Great Britain out, desperately wants to help these sort of the nation that we have such clear ties to out. But he's limited strongly by these neutrality acts. So what he's able to do as the public opinion begins to shift in his favor because of the fall of France, because of the Battle of Britain, which is on the news every single night on the radio, you start to get increase in defense spending. But he can sell that as a jobs program. This is an anti-depression measure to spend $1 billion making weapons. He ends up trading some old decrepit destroyers for military bases that Britain is no longer able to maintain and operate. But that was actually a pretty good deal for America. He's able to allow Britain to buy U.S. planes, once again, sort of a jobs program, and kind of does it on the sly on his own. And then by the fall of 1940, he institutes the first peacetime military draft. And he is sort of testing the waters. Can I win my third term, something unprecedented in American society, and still prepare America for what he believes is an inevitable conflict? And his opposition in this is the America First Committee, which is America First, it's a phrase I'm sure you've heard before, given our Donald Trump's sort of taken it as his slogan, was people like Gerald Nye, famous people like Charles Lindbergh, supported by a major newspaper chain. Think of the Hearst newspaper chain as having the same political capital and cultural capital as Fox News today. A huge number of members would be hearing about it. 800,000 people joined this, saying no war, no death for American boys. We must not join this war. Really, you see elements of, pacifism in here, elements of isolationism, elements even of anti-Semitism, saying that this isn't our fight. Maybe Hitler's not actually such a bad guy. There's lots of people lumped into this America First idea. So when, for example, Donald Trump uses this America First ideal today, some people hear tones of racism and anti-Semitism, where other people hear tones of nationalism, and both are valid interpretations given the history of that phrase America First. But in 1940, he wins again. The victories of Roosevelt are not as overwhelming as they were in 1936 and in 1932, but we can see electoral college-wise, if you win 449 votes, you're doing pretty well. And so Roosevelt now is sort of freed to take a much more aggressive stance. He doesn't have to run for election for another 4 years. He will, and he will win for his fourth term, but he's now sort of free to take more aggressive actions. So as the war gets increasingly worse, he gets increasingly aggressive in his policies. So after a year into the war, he is now able to sort of do lend-lease policy. We will lend you weapons, we'll sell you weapons, we'll give you any weapons if that nation is vital to the defense of the U.S. That's a pretty vague statement, which means Britain is vital to the defense of the U.S., China is vital to the defense of the U.S., sure. And then he goes even further, which is sort of, I'm sure, gave Gerald Nye fits of anger. He says that America will move the goods halfway across the Atlantic Ocean. As British ships are being sunk by German submarines, we will help them get at least basically to Iceland. And so that means that now American ships are being put in harm's way on the Atlantic Ocean. This is the exact thing that Gerald Nye and the isolationists were warning of. FDR feels sort of freed and able to take these actions, something that he and I see as absolutely necessary for the time. Then, as Germany invades USSR and U-boats start attacking American vessels, and Japan is invading Indochina, which is Vietnam, at this point, America takes a much more aggressive economic stand. So first of all, we start arming merchant vessels, which means that FDR is essentially provoking war. He really was attempting to provoke a conflict. He knew that Americans would not get involved in this war unless we were attacked, and he is setting up boats to start shooting. And he knows what's happening. He knows what he's doing. And the US and Britain start coming up with shared war goals. Churchill and FDR start meeting on boats. They meet in Florida. They meet off the coast of Newfoundland. And they are meeting to sort of say, we must unite together. We are not at war yet, and yet we have a meeting with a nation that is at war about shared war goals. That is not neutral. That is not. But the most important thing he does by far is the embargo of Japanese oil and scrap metal. So saying America was the great oil exporting nation and the great iron and steel producing nation of the world. And by cutting Japan off of their oil and metal, we are cutting off their military lifeline. And so now the clock is ticking. Once we cut off oil, what's Japan going to do? Are they going to stop invading China? No. Are they going to somehow get our oil? Not likely. So they need another source of oil. Either they have to stop their military campaigns, which is not really going to be possible given that the government is the military, or, sorry about the bell, or they're going to do something else. So anyway, this is just FDR and Churchill meetings. We have a picture of that. There they are. The great bromance between these two Navy-loving dudes is sort of been memorialized in lots of movies and books. It's sort of a source of fascination, their friendship. But, so here we go. We have here Japan. And they have, by 1940, have taken over Manchuria, parts of China, and Indochina, especially Vietnam. They need oil. Oil is down here in Indonesia. How are they going to get that oil? Well, they could just go this way. However, there are two major barriers between Japan and the oil. Number one is the British Navy right here in Singapore. Number two is the American Navy right here in the Philippines. Now it sort of matters that we have the Philippines. So America is expecting an attack. We know what we've done. We know we've pushed them into a corner that is untenable for the Japanese military. We are expecting them to attack the Philippines. We are getting ready for them to attack the Philippines because that is the most straight line to, once again, is the oil. They don't attack the Philippines. They attack, as we know, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And so what Japan does is on December 7th, 1941, they launch what they think is a sucker punch. That if they can knock out the American Navy in Honolulu, I'm sorry, not Honolulu, in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, then what they could do is they could basically cripple the American Navy for what they believe is 5 to 7 years. And especially if they sink those aircraft carriers, they could cripple the American Navy for 5 to 7 years. That would give them the time and space to then go launch an invasion. So first they attack the Hawaiian Islands, then they attack, can see Guam shortly afterwards. They attack Singapore shortly afterwards, which is a fun battle to learn about. And then they invade Indonesia in order to gain those resources, especially oil. They also attack, as I said, the Philippines as well. So we have here a military campaign, where you have like a sucker punch over here in Hawaii and then absolute invasion. It is a huge victories across the board. Japan believes, oh my God, I can't believe we won all these things. But that's the end of American neutrality. America declares full military mobilization. At that point, we really focus the vast majority of our energies on Europe. That's believed to be the more pressing concern. So in World War I, World War II, the vast majority of resources in the first couple of years go to defeating Hitler and Mussolini. And Europe, seen as much more pressing. And then in the last 2 years of the war, our focus is much more heavily on Japan. There are battles in the years before then, but the sort of the great battles, the Iwo Jimas, the Okinawas, the dropping of the atomic bomb, etc., those really take place in 1944 and 1945, once sort of America and the Allies have gotten sort of a handle on Europe and Soviet Union has not collapsed, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that was helpful. I hope you, someone at least out there watched this and didn't read the book. And if you have any questions, be sure to let me know. All right, with that said, let me see how I can turn this thing off.